We've been learning a lot about the Civil War. The Civil War was fought between the Union, or the North, and the Confederacy, or the South. The main issue that caused the Civil War was the issue of slavery. In the North, the economy depended on factories making and selling goods, and in the South, the economy depended on growing crops such as tobacco, sugarcane, and cotton. For these big farms in the South, or plantations, to be run, they depended on slave labor, meaning they forced African American people to work for them with no pay. Abolitionists in the North wanted to make slavery illegal in new territories that were added. They also wanted to get rid of slavery in the South. People in the South did not want to get rid of slavery. Eventually, they seceded, forming the Confederacy and starting the Civil War. One of the key events that led up to the war was the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was in Confederacy land, but was controlled by the Union. Confederate soldiers attacked and eventually gained control. The war officially started with the First Battle of Manassas, or the First Battle of Bull Run. The war then dragged on for 4 years, being bloodier than anyone ever thought it would be. Today, we are going to learn about how the war finally came to an end. But first, let's go over some of the vocabulary words that we'll see. United. If something is united, it is joined together as one thing or unit. The opposite, or antonym, of united is divided. At the beginning of this unit, we learned that before the Civil War, the United States was divided over the issue of slavery. They didn't agree about it. If a room full of people are arguing about something, they are divided. If students are arguing about how to decorate the cafeteria for a party, they are divided. If parents are discussing how they can help raise money for the school, they are united. Basketball teammates passing the ball to each other and scoring a basket are acting united. And even though the United States were divided before the Civil War, today all of the states in the United States are united. Equality. Equality is the state of being the same, or fairness. Abolitionists wanted equality for enslaved people. Prosperity. Prosperity means financial success or good fortune. Rival. A rival is a person who is competing for the same thing or position as another. During the Civil War, the Union Yankees and Confederate rebels were rivals. Ransacked. Ransacked means searched through something to steal goods, or looted. In 1865, news stories did not travel as quickly as they do today. There were no televisions or telephones, or even radios. There were newspapers, but the news stories could be about things that happened days or even weeks before. There were also telegraphs, which were short typed messages that required special skills to read. It could take several days for news to reach soldiers who were miles away from a town or a city with a telegraph wire. It could also take days or even weeks for news to reach their families. In tiny towns all over America, parents, wives, and children of soldiers were waiting for a son, husband, or father to return home from the war. So, on April 9, 1865, it took a little while for the news to spread that in a small farmhouse in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee surrendered the remainder of his Confederate army. Within days, most other Confederate armies that had been fighting in other parts of the country surrendered as well. The rebel soldiers laid down their weapons, made oaths to give up the rebellion and never fight against the United States again, and walked home. Remember, the rebel soldiers were people that were fighting for the Confederacy. The Union soldiers, or those soldiers that were fighting for the North, were relieved. At last, the long Civil War was ended, and the North had won. It was time to return home, rest, and rebuild the nation. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to being united again. Remember, being united means that they are all together as one. For the most part, the cities of the North had not been damaged. With the end of the war, Northerners started to think about how to make the country bigger. They focused on building more railroads and spreading westward across the Mississippi River, through Missouri and Kansas, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to California. For people in the North, life would finally start getting back to normal. They were glad to have something to make in their factories other than weapons and uniforms for war. Most of the battles had been fought in the South. Southerners were relieved that the war was over as well, even if the Confederacy had lost the war. At least there was no more fighting. Nearly all the towns and cities were now ruined and burned, smashed by cannonballs, and ransacked by armies in search of food. Farmlands, roads, railroad tracks, and bridges had been destroyed as well. Times were hardest by far in the South after the war. The U.S. government sent money and supplies, as well as soldiers to keep order and start rebuilding towns and cities. This was called Reconstruction, because they were rebuilding or reconstructing the South. But it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. Remember, prosperity is wealth or good fortune, and equality is fairness. For millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, all of this destruction not only meant the end of the war, it meant freedom from a life of slavery. The enslaved Africans were now free people. They could not be forced to work on plantations anymore. They could not be sent away from their families anymore. They were free from slavery and ready to start their lives all over again. Remember earlier you heard that it took some time for news to travel? Well, it took 2 months for the news that the war had ended to reach African Americans in the state of Texas. The Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, to announce the end of the war and the abolition of slavery. When the African American people in Galveston heard the news, they immediately began to celebrate with prayer, feasting, music, and dancing. Today, Juneteenth is a holiday tradition celebrated annually on June 19th in many states across the country. It is the oldest known celebration recognizing the end of slavery. Many African Americans freed from slavery wanted to get as far away from the South as possible. Some moved north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C. Many arrived with no possessions and no money, nothing but the clothing on their backs and hope for a better life. They worked in factories, built new businesses, and created new neighborhoods, schools, and communities. However, African Americans still faced some of the toughest challenges of all, for although they were free, they did not have all the same rights as white Americans in the North or the South. The end of the Civil War was the beginning of a new age in America. There were still hard times ahead, as well as sadness, but the country was unified as a single nation. The Civil War produced many heroes, including one of the most famous Americans of all, Abraham Lincoln. His face appears today on the penny and the $5 bill. There are thousands of towns, buildings, roads, bridges, tunnels, such as the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and people named after him. In Washington, D.C., there is a giant monument honoring him called the Lincoln Memorial. A monument is a structure built in memory of someone or something. 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave the very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 100 years after the end of slavery, Dr. King and other African Americans continued to work and struggle for fair treatment and equal rights. Throughout the Civil War, Harriet Tubman continued risking her life to free enslaved people and end slavery. During some battles, she also worked as a nurse and sometimes as a spy for the Union Army. Because Harriet Tubman knew the roads and secret trails all around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, she was able to spy on the Confederate Army, telling Union generals in which direction the army was going and how many men they had. After the war, Harriet Tubman moved to Washington, D.C., where she helped the thousands of newly freed African Americans find jobs and homes and begin their lives anew. She also worked for women's rights. During the time of the Civil War, women, black and white alike, were not allowed to vote. That was one of the many important changes America still had to make in order for all of its citizens to truly be free. Women can vote now. Ulysses S. Grant was a hero throughout the North. He went on to become President of the United States in 1869. His old rival, or person he was competing against, Robert E. Lee, moved back to his farm in Virginia, but he was never the same again. He died 5 years later, sad and regretful, haunted by all of the things he could have or should have done differently during the war, but was still proud to have fought for Virginia. In many parts of America, people were eager to move on into the future. The war had brought about a few positive changes besides freeing African Americans and keeping the country together. The North had developed new railroad lines to help deliver war supplies. Companies were eager to expand those railroads, especially those in the West. Within a few years, there were new railroads crisscrossing the country, from New York to California and back again. Telegraph wires had expanded as well, so it became possible for a person in New York and a person in California to communicate, share news, and conduct business without waiting weeks for a letter to be delivered by train or on horseback. In northern factories and schools, the Civil War had encouraged a new generation of inventors and scientists. Now that the war was over, those inventors could think about new ways to help people, instead of thinking of ways to win the war. They invented new trains, new telegraphs, and new machines of all sorts. Doctors had discovered new types of medicines and new ways to treat injuries and diseases. The Civil War changed the United States in many ways. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead, millions were badly wounded. At the same time, the nation was once again one nation, and millions of former enslaved African Americans were now free. Many fought for this freedom, including many African Americans. Now all Americans were working toward a better, brighter future.
Hello everyone. We finished up the Civil War today. We talked about how that war ended. We've been talking about the Civil War for a while, and the Civil War went on for a very long time. How long did the Civil War last? It went on for 4 years, 4 full years that our nation was at war with itself. Who won the Civil War? How did it end? Did the Confederacy win or did the Union win? You've got it. The Union won. Who surrendered to who at the end? General Lee surrendered to General Grant, letting the Union win the war. What did that mean? What did the end of the war mean and the Union winning? We talked about on our timeline about how during the Civil War, our nation was split in two. We had the Union and the Confederacy that were trying to form their own nation. Was that the case at the end of the war? No. The end of the war meant that we were finally united again as one nation. It also meant, more importantly, it meant that all enslaved people were finally free and that slavery was outlawed in the U.S. After the war ended, who had the bigger challenge, the North or the South? The Union or the Confederacy? Who had a harder time after the war ended? most of the battles in the Civil War were fought in Confederate territory in the South. Because of that, the South had a harder time rebuilding after the war ended. What kind of changes took place in America after the war ended? What things were different now? There's a lot we could have said for that one. A lot of formerly enslaved people moved to the north to start new lives. There were better roadways and railways that were created. More inventions were being made. For a long time during the war, everyone was so focused on the fighting and taking care of things happening during the war that they didn't get to invent things or learn things or experiment with things. So it kind of things came to a standstill. But with the war over, people were able to go back to work and go back to doing those things and making improvements to their society. What about this remarkable lady right here, Harriet Tubman? What did she do when the war ended? She continued to help the newly freed people find homes and work, and she later worked for women's rights. What about Ulysses S Grant? What did General Grant do after the war? He became our president. He became the president of the United States. The president during the war was Abraham Lincoln. How do you think Abraham Lincoln felt when the war was finally over? Do you think he felt relieved or happy? I think he probably would. I think that would be a really good feeling for him when the war was and the fighting was finally done. All right, my friends, we have got Harriet Tubman. We have got the secession of the Confederacy, the election of Abraham Lincoln, Clara Barton, the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and way over here, we've got the Red Cross, which was founded by Clara Barton after the war. We've got one more thing we're going to add, and that's the surrender. General Lee's surrender to General Grant. This happened after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but before the Red Cross was founded. So I'm going to put it right in between the two. Today, my friends, on our assignment, we have two different things that we're going to do. Go ahead and open up the PDF that's attached, and I will jump on my computer and show you what those two things are.
All right, my friends, on that first page, on the PDF attached to today's assignment, there is a map of part of the United States. In this map, we can see that these states that are shown here in plain white were Union states. States that are shaded in gray were Confederate states. The star, our key or legend, is telling us that these stars represents locations where major battles were fought. We are going to use our map, our legend, and the information provided to answer the following three questions. The first one says, in which states were there major Civil War battles? Which states were there major Civil War battles? How are we going to know? What do we need to look at to figure out where the major Civil War battles were at? We're going to use our legend or our key. This tells us that to find major battles, we need to look for stars. So if we look at our stars on our map, we can see that there are stars in Pennsylvania, we can see that there are stars in Virginia. Oops. There we go. There are stars in Kentucky and Tennessee. There we go. There are stars in Georgia and in Mississippi. And there's one here in California. And one up here, if we look a little closer at our map, in Maryland. Go ahead and write those states on that very first question. I didn't write all of them, but write as many as you can, as many states as you see those stars in on that first question. Let's look and see what number 2 is asking us. Number 2 says which state had the most major battles. So we're looking at major battles again. We're looking for the state that has the most stars in it. Let's see, there's only 2 in Georgia, only 1 in Mississippi. We've got 4 in Tennessee, more in Tennessee than we've seen so far. 1 in Kentucky. Ooh, let's look at Virginia. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stars in Virginia. It looks like there are more stars in Virginia than any other state on our map. There were more major battles fought in the state of Virginia. Why do you think there were more battles in Virginia than anywhere else? Why Virginia? Remember, in Virginia there was a city named Richmond, and that was the capital of the Confederacy. Because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, the Union sent a lot of attacks there to try to take over the capital. Our very last question on that next page says, where and when did General Lee surrender to General Grant? We learned about this today, but we also have that information on our map. We have our key that tells us where major battles were, what our Union states were, and what our Confederate states were. But within the map, we've got a little bit of extra information provided right here, where this triangle symbol that's not on our key can be found. This is telling us this triangle represents Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered to Grant. So our question says where and when. We know it was the Appomattox Courthouse, and it tells us when, April 9th, 1865. So on that one we can say Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865. Ooh, friends, I'm looking at my answers. Guess what? I did something wrong in my answers. When I'm answering questions like this, do I answer with just words or phrases like I did? No. Make sure we are writing. We need to make sure we are writing in complete sentences. I didn't do a very good job, so guess what? Now I have to go back and I have to fix my answers and make sure that they are written in complete sentences. So instead of saying Appomattox Courthouse, April 9th, 1865, I need to make that a complete sentence. General Lee surrendered to General Grant. There we go. At Appomattox Courthouse on April 19th, 1865. All right, am I okay now, or am I still missing something? I'm missing my period at the end. Which state had the most major battles? This one will be easy to turn into a complete sentence. I can say Virginia had the most major battles. There we go, the Civil War. And my period. I've got my subject, my predicate, my period, and I've started it with a capital. And on this one, let's see. Major Civil War battles were fought in Pennsylvania. Remember, when we have more than 3 things listed, we have to put commas in between them. Pennsylvania, comma, Virginia, comma, Kentucky, comma, and Tennessee, not comma. We need a final mark, a period. All right, friends, it is a pain, to have to go back and fix our answers later. It's best if we remember to write in full, complete sentences first. Make sure anytime we're doing any kind of test or assignment that has questions like this, make sure we are writing in complete and full sentences. Double check when you're done. When you double check, like I did, you might have to go back and fix your sentences. But it's easiest if you try to remember to write in complete sentences first. Speaking of complete sentences, my friends, on the next part of our assignment today, we have another Civil War journal entry. Like all of our past Civil War journal entry, this one will be 3 to 5 complete and full sentences. 3 to 5 complete and full sentences. Our sentences today should answer the questions: how did the Civil War end? How did the Civil War end? Who won? Who won? Was it the Union or the Confederacy? Who surrendered? To whom? And where? Where did that surrender take place? And lastly, how did the United States change after the war? What are some ways that the United States changed when the war was finished? Make sure those sentences are full. Make sure those sentences are complete. They should start with a capital. They should have a subject and a predicate, and end with a final mark. Make sure you're answering these questions. How did it end? Who won? Who surrendered to whom? And where did that surrender take place? And how did the United States change after the war was over? You have got 2 pages to answer those questions and write those 3 to 5 sentences. When you are done in this box where I wrote our notes, you are going to draw a picture of something that will help you remember the end of the war. You might want to draw a picture of the surrender at the Appomattox courthouse. You choose. I said Appomattox again, didn't I? Appomattox. Appomattox. I get those letters mixed up sometimes. Appomattox, not Appomattox. Sorry, friends. At the Appomattox courthouse. You might want to draw that, General Grant and General Lee. You decide. When you are done, go ahead and turn this one in, and you are all finished with knowledge today. In our next lesson, we will review some of the things that we've learned about the Civil War, and in our lesson after that, we will do our test on our Civil War unit.